I want to start this video off by saying I am a cisgendered heterosexual male. Thus, all of my views on transgender are from the perspective of an outsider looking in. And I'm going to warn you right now that what I have to say is controversial, and feelings may get hurt. My motivation for supporting the trans community is that I believe it will play a very important role in my political goal of gender equality. And of course, the fact that trans people shouldn't be marginalized. No group of people should. I want to talk to you today about trans elitism, and why I believe this is going to hurt the trans community. But first, let's talk about some terminology. And let's face it, the terminology is perhaps the most difficult thing for outsiders to grasp. Transsexual used to mean person who identified as the opposite sex they were born with, and attempted to modify their appearance both in dress and through surgery, along with changes in voice and body language to pass as the opposite sex. Whereas cross-dressers were typically heterosexual men who dressed in drag privately for autoerotic thrill, now typically called transvestic fetishism, since it's an action and not an identity. Drag queen was a cross-dresser going drag as a public performance, and may or may not be gay. Transgender is supposed to be an umbrella term to incorporate all of the above, since gender is an expression of a sexual characteristic, i.e. an action, and trans meaning transform. Thus, anyone that transforms the expression of their sex, such as cross-dressing, should be under the trans umbrella. But somehow, transsexual has been depreciated, and transgender now means what we used to call transsexual. It's the same weird phenomenon of the word sex being replaced by the word gender, when these two things are supposed to be different. No one can identify as a gender. You identify as a sex. Gender is merely how you express. An example of this is a tomboy. A tomboy is a biological female who identifies as female but expresses herself with masculine behavior. Her sex is female, her actions are masculine, which is a gender. So any discussion on transgender is very difficult because of how fucking butchered these words have become. So I'm going to be using transgender to mean a person born as one sex who identifies as the other. Now, to kick off my discussion about trans elitism, I want to address a video made by a trans woman who is, quite frankly, being a trans elitist.
Hi guys, it's Elle, and I want to take a moment to talk to you guys about something I've been noticing recently. Something that, if I'm being completely honest, really disturbs me. And I want to add that this video is not meant to offend anyone. This is just my opinion and my point of view. If you do get offended, well, that's on you. Now that we got that out of the way. So basically, not too long ago, I was at a party here in New York City. It was a Marc Jacobs event. And if I'm not mistaken, it might have been an LGBT event. I say that because mostly everyone there was either gay or a drag queen, not that there's anything wrong with that. So I'm there with a good friend of mine, having drinks and enjoying my time, when out of nowhere I overhear the conversation that the two people next to us are having, and it happened to be a gay guy and his friend who was a girl. In a nutshell, the guy is telling the girl that he's falling in love with his friend who happens to be straight, and he's going on about how he knows that if he were a girl, they would be like perfect for one another. Honestly, he believes that they're soulmates, and the only problem is that he happens to be a boy and his friend is straight. I start to feel really bad for this guy as I listen to him more and more go on about how he's found the love of his life, he's found his soulmate, and circumstances are keeping them apart. And then out of nowhere, I overhear this guy tell his friend that he's actually ordered hormones online and that he plans to transition into a girl. And I'm pretty sure that that was the first time she heard it as well, because I could tell by the tone in her voice when she said really, that it was like a surprised tone. I mean, she was more surprised than I was. I was just baffled. She asked him if he always knew that he was transgender and if this is something that he's been struggling with for a long time. And he says to her, no, I've never wanted to be a girl until I met this guy, but now I know that I'm meant to be a girl. Because apparently falling in love with a straight guy is now a sign of gender dysphoria, right?
Okay, so this guy fell in love with a straight guy and wanted to become a woman so the straight guy would love him. Okay, that already sounds crazy. But then again, a man wanting to go on estrogen and cut off his penis to be a girl, for any reason, sounds crazy. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of people who are transgender, but you have to understand, a person who goes on hormones and cuts off their penis, it doesn't matter what the reason was. The fact you did that already sounds crazy in the eyes of everybody who isn't transgender. But can I just point out, that last thing you said about his circumstances is not gender dysphoria. May I remind you that the title of your video is called "You Are Not Transgender," not titled "You Do Not Have Gender Dysphoria." A transgender person may or may not suffer from gender dysphoria, so please do not conflate the two things.
I ended up walking away after a minute or two because I couldn't stand to hear this guy making more plans for his future womanhood and life with his straight friend. It's crazy because before being transgender became a more mainstream thing, I never heard of situations like this. But now, every day, it seems like there's more and more questionable trans experiences out there.
What gets me about this statement is you make it sound like transgender is an exclusive club and only certain elites are allowed into the clubhouse, and oh god, these fakers are faking their way into our clubhouse. That's what it sounds like you're saying. We're special snowflakes, and damn it, these ordinary snowflakes are getting into our special snowflake club. That's the kind of elitist bullshit it sounds like you're trying to say.
Just yesterday, I watched a YouTube video of some guy who thought he looked so pretty the first time that he put on makeup and girls' clothing that he assumed in his mind that meant that he was meant to be a girl. So he started transitioning. Just listen to that, how crazy that sounds. He put on makeup, he put on girls' clothing, and he thought he looked so pretty that he was like, okay, well, I'm just going to become a girl now because clearly I'm meant to be a girl.
So what? Is it crazy because he's too old? And he should have known he was trans when he was younger? Look, I hate to break it to you, but not everybody realizes they're transgender or gay at the same age. I had an uncle who was straight. He even got married. And one day he became bi-curious, and that progressed into bisexual. He had affairs, and then realized he was completely gay, divorced his wife, and has been living with men ever since. I had a childhood friend who seemed to be straight and cis, and then, in our freshman year, we had dress as the opposite sex day, where girls dress up like boys and boys dress up like girls. It was that day that he dressed up as a girl that he realized this was the way he was always meant to be. He didn't transition until after graduation. When I met him years later, he was a her, and explained the whole thing to me. That it all began with that one day. I had a friend not long ago, at age 23, singed his chest hair with a cigarette, and the burnt hair smelled, so he shaved his chest. And then he figured why not shave his legs and armpits too, and from that day onward continued to shave his body smooth. He began to detest body hair, and then it progressed into wanting to have even more feminine appearance. He grew his hair long, and then got his ears pierced, and then his belly button pierced, and then began wearing dresses, then makeup. Then he came out as transgender, changing his name and asking to be called by female pronouns. In fact, I have actually heard stories about other men going through the exact same thing. It started with shaving their chest or legs for some reason, and suddenly they preferred being hairless, and that progressed into full-blown gender identity. Some people have an underlying predisposition to be transgender, and one day all it takes is for one event to trigger this underlying desire and bring it to the conscious mind. You don't get to be up on your high horses and invalidate them. So this guy had his epiphany that he is trans when he dressed up as a girl one day and suddenly felt it was right. And that was his moment of revelation. Why is that crazy?
Bizarre. Honestly, I just think it's bullshit, and I never want to hurt or disregard anyone's feelings, but I stand by it. It's bullshit. And for those of you out there who are going to be like, well, everyone's trans experience is different. Well, I agree. What I don't agree with is exploiting something that is so real and so serious to some of us for the sake of personal gain. At no point during my transition did I think to myself, well, I'm going to transition so that I can get a man, or I'm going to transition so that I can get some looks.
You transitioned because it made you happy. They transitioned because it made them happy. What's the problem?
Like, it was never about gaining anything except inner peace and inner wholesomeness. Nowadays, there's people who even do it for attention, and I'm talking about YouTubers. There's actual YouTubers who are now transitioning for the sake of getting views. I just can't stand to see people exploiting something that is so incredibly sensitive and important.
How do you know these people are doing it for the attention? If they confess that they're doing it for the attention, then they are not claiming to be transgender, they are claiming they are cross-dressing for attention. If they did not confess they're doing it for the attention, how the fuck do you know they're doing it for the attention?
You're not transgender because you put on some lipstick and you feel attractive. I'm sorry, but you're not. And you're not transgendered if you happen to fall in love with a straight member of the opposite sex. You're just not. Being transgendered isn't a choice, and I honestly think it's fucked up that there's people out there abusing modern science for the sake of personal gain.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean by abusing modern science. You mean hormones? They're abusing the modern science of hormone replacement therapy? What the fuck do you mean abusing modern science? Is this supposed to be some reference to transgender as a very real and proven physical thing? Because if so, sorry, the science doesn't actually say that. The best anyone knows with transgender is it's a condition based on the way you feel emotionally. You emotionally dislike being the sex you are and you'd rather be a different sex. That's it, that's transgender. The cause is anyone's guess. If I didn't know better, I'd swear that you are someone with gender dysphoria, a mental condition not so dissimilar to body dysmorphia, where the individual feels an extreme revulsion towards a particular part of their body. And they have this compulsive need, this obsessive need to modify that part of their body. Normally it's a facial feature like the nose. Can people with gender dysmorphia be transgender? Of course. But not every transgender person has to have gender dysphoria. Plenty of trans people don't hate their penis, and they don't want it removed. Again, I think you have gender dysphoria and it pisses you off when other trans people don't. And you want to create this elitist mentality that there are real transgender people who absolutely hate their reproductive organs so much they obsess about it and it drives them insane. And then there are fakers. But be careful with your elitism, because other transgender people could reverse this and claim that men who obsessively want to remove their penis aren't real transgender. They just have a gendered version of body dysmorphia, where they need to alter or amputate a part of their body, just like the people who spend their life with an obsessive need to amputate their legs and identify as an amputee, which is a very real thing. And they could claim that's all people like you are. You're not a real transgender, you just have body dysmorphia. Your obsession with removing your penis is no different than the person who wants to amputate their legs. So it's best not to get all elitist. Your elitism, if practiced by enough trans people, could divide the trans community at a time when transgender is just beginning to become accepted.
Honestly, I think these people need psychological help.
Oh God, they need help. Says a man dressed as a woman, talking in a strained high-pitched voice using a female name, wanting to get their dick snipped off, and asking people to call them a girl. Look, for ages, all transgender people were looked upon as mentally ill and in need of help. Now that trans activism is becoming a popular thing, more people are accepting of it, and others merely pretend to be accepting of it like the emperor's new clothes, because they fear social backlash. And here you are, looking down at other trans people's experiences who do not match your own, and whose methods don't meet your seal of approval, and you dare to call them mentally ill. Where the fuck do you get off? Bitch, get off your high horses right now. I know exactly what you're doing. Somewhere inside, you evaluate your situation and feel fear that what you're going through, is nothing more than a psychological problem, and most people view your situation as a mental problem. So in order to validate your situation as somehow legit, and defend your ego from the stigma of mental illness, you target other people whose trans experience differs from your own, and you call them mentally ill. It's like, if you can look down on other trannies and call them mentally ill, then somehow you're not totally crazy. It's like the woman who puts on 15 pounds, feels insecure about her body, and decides to make rude, snarky, fat-shaming comments at the woman who is very obese, because in her mind, as long as she has a really fat person she can make fun of, it makes her own obesity look tame by comparison. And they can convince themselves of bullshit like they are a healthy kind of obese, and that other person is an unhealthy, morbidly obese. This phenomenon is called bullying. The psychological mechanics are the same. An individual feels shame or loss of control and acts belligerent to a more vulnerable target so that they can feel superior and in control.
Abusing modern science for the sake of personal gain. Honestly, I think these people need psychological help, not hormones. We are constantly fighting stereotypes and have such a long road ahead of us when it comes to acceptance and understanding. And honestly, I feel like people like these are just setting us back. Because if I think they're fucking crazy when I hear about their stories, I can only imagine what the average person must think. I don't want to have to feel ashamed of being transgender because of people who are fucked up in the head.
And I'll tell you where this comes from in regards to trans elitism. Long ago, gays were seen as freaks and hideous, dangerous abominations. They were classified as mentally ill by the psychology profession. Advocates who wanted to force gay acceptance onto people used pseudoscience like they were born that way. People suspected hormones, genetics, epigenetics. The use of born that way was used to ease people's minds. The preconceived notion was that these people were dangerous perverts. They were immoral sinners. They were mentally ill, sick in the head, needed to get help or fixed up, or just needed to find a good woman to straighten them out. But the myth of born that way set people's mind at ease. Even the theory of women trapped in a man's body was was introduced to explain how it's possible for a man to want to be with another man, and it would also explain why so many of them had feminine mannerisms. They were born with a woman's brain inside their male body. Yes, that made so much sense back then. The problem is, science never supported this. Hormone levels were normal. There is no such thing as being born with a female and male brain. While there are some sketchy sex differences in some studies, in some of the tests, some of the times, that doesn't prove the brain responds to stimuli because they were born that way. They could just as easily have become that way. So there is no default male or female brain that science has definitively proven. So the entire theory of being a man with a woman's brain is not really supported. Now, a study has shown that the youngest child has a higher likelihood of homosexuality. This is called the fraternal birth order effect. Unfortunately, there are also problems with this study, such as studies that found the opposite conclusion. Although the study has been repeated with success, it has been repeated without success. Also, no study has shown birth order effect to affect homosexual women. Ultimately, no one knows why a person is homosexual or bisexual, becomes gay, or always was gay. And ultimately, none of it should matter. If a person is gay, that's their business. Whether they are that way due to unresolved emotional conflicts in their childhood, whether they were exposed to evil, atheist, leftist ideals, or whether they made that personal choice to give the middle finger to society, it doesn't matter. Now that homosexuality is mostly accepted, the new civil rights movement is transgender. And we see the same pattern of born this way being used to push for larger social acceptance. And yes, the same fraternal birth order effect has been found in transgender people. But then that leaves the question of, why are some people gay, some people bi, some heterotransgender, bisexual transgender, and some homosexual transgender? And again, an absence of birth order affecting female to male transgender people. And of course, studies that exist to the contrary. There are transgender people that have always felt they were the wrong sex, and those who became aware of this feeling later in their preteens or their teens, and others who became aware of this in their early or even later 20s. Why are there trans women who are super feminine, and others very butch like tomboys? Since sexuality and sexual orientation go right along with femininity and masculinity, this shouldn't be possible if we accept that transgender behavior, identity, and sexuality are all products of biology, and it is the brain's prenatal hormones that determine these things. Also, there are trans women who can really pass because they were born with very feminine features, and those who do not pass so well because they were born with extremely masculine features. These features are also genetic, and prenatal hormones do play a part in the physical masculinization and feminization. Simply put, there is far too much behavioral diversity for prenatal hormones to explain every single sex difference. And the fact only with males do we find any study even suggesting that hormones have an effect on sexual identity or sexuality. It's also possible that prenatal hormones could have some feminizing effect on the male brain that merely creates a predisposition to become, at some point in their life, derailed from the cisgender, heterosexual path of normality. So it is possible that some people become gay or trans at age 7, 12, 16, 25, or 30, based on life experience and internal emotional conflicts playing on the mind of a person born with a predisposition to be in some way feminine. Nature, nurture, or a combination, who knows? And I say this, who cares? If trans people insist with great conviction that transsexuality is a matter of biology, i.e. born that way, then what they are saying is transgender is a medical birth defect. They are simply born defective, botched, born with a disease. Make no mistake, if you were born trans, you were born with a disease, no different than being born with cleft lip, blind, deaf, or missing a limb. The people with gender dysphoria are miserable, and they suffer. How can this not be a disease? I believe many of these people run away from the possibility that they have a mental disease because it hurts the ego to think of themselves as mentally defective, mentally botched. But ask yourself this, is being neurologically defective better than being psychologically defective? Would you hold your head up higher knowing you suffer from a neurological disease instead of a psychological disease? Some of you may be saying, I don't consider this to be a disease. And to that, I say you're on the right track. And not every transgender person has an obsessive hatred of their reproductive organs and live with the utmost desperation to remove them. The basis of trans elitism is not only based on the pretense that one has a medical condition, but that the symptom of that medical condition is gender dysphoria. Trans elitists are really just trying to redefine transgender as gender dysphoria, and invalidate other trans people who do not display gender dysphoria. So let's take a look at a trans woman with gender dysphoria.
And surgeries is a real pain too. The fact that I have to wait 2 more years to get my vaginoplasty and like a breast augmentation is really, really annoying because I wish I could get it now, honestly, because that's what I think would make me feel better about myself and make me happier, and so that I wouldn't have to go through all the pain in order to just look like a normal girl. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's honestly such a struggle, and unless you're like a trans person and you've tucked, you don't understand how painful it can be to do it for like extended periods of time. The next thing would definitely be dysphoria. Gender dysphoria. It's awful. It is atrocious waking up every single day and seeing things that you don't relate with, that you don't feel you need to have. Like, you feel disgusted. Like, I feel disgusted with my body. I feel disgusted with my body, and whenever I wake up and look in the mirror and see everything that's down there, it's it is so difficult for me, because I know that that's not what is supposed to be there. I know that I am supposed to be a girl, and just waking up every single day and seeing something that isn't supposed to be there.
This person has to be, by psychological definition, mentally diseased. And I don't mean bad, dangerous, or crazy. I mean diseased in the way a person with depression or anxiety is mentally diseased. Mental disease is any thoughts, feelings, or actions that cause difficulty functioning or distress to the self or those around the patient. And these thoughts, feelings, and actions must break from social norms. Example: being really worried about your kid who ran away from home, being unable to sleep and being nervous about that, that's not a disease, that's a normal reaction. Yes, it's distress, but it's a normal distress normal people feel. An example, here's another example. Washing your hands is healthy, hygienic practice. Washing your hands 10 or even 15 times a day may be excessive, but it's not a mental disease. It becomes a mental disease when you wash your hands to the point of producing sores, or when you are flooded with distracting thoughts of needing to get to the sink and wash your hands. When this preoccupation with clean hands causes anxiety, depression, or difficulty functioning, then it's a disease. Here we see a grown adult crying from the emotional torment of being born male. This is every bit as much of a disease as a grown adult breaking down and crying because no matter how much they wash their hands, they just don't feel clean. Then there are the trans people who do not look in the mirror and cry. They do not want to remove their penis. They don't want sex reassignment surgery. Some trans people dismiss these types of people as merely cross-dressers. Though, technically, that should fall under the umbrella term of transgender, but I already covered that. The thing is, if you identify as the sex you were not born as, regardless of everything else, you should be included as transgender. If a male, such as the one in this story, puts on a dress and makeup, and falls in love with their beauty, and wants to keep doing this from time to time, they are a cross-dresser. But if they want to be like this all the time, and they just want to look like this forever, and wish for people to call them by female pronouns, then it's not a temporary stunt done for autoerotic thrill, it's an identity. Identifying as the sex you were not born as is transgender, not only by the old umbrella definition, but even by the new definition that means the old depreciated transsexual. So here we have some people who are horribly unhappy, gender dysphoric, absolutely distressed about their sex, clearly suffering from a disease of the mind or the brain. And on the other hand, we have people who, for whatever reason, just feel happier and more comfortable dressing and acting feminine and want the world to address them as female. Those people are not showing symptoms of disease. They might be frowned on as freaks or insane by homophobic heteronormative society, but they are not by psychology's definition diseased. Those transgender people who do not suffer from gender dysphoria are the ones getting called fake by the trans elitists. So the irony is, quote, real trans people are diseased psychologically and or neurologically. Fake trans people are not diseased. Ergo, this trans elitist is marketing transgender as a disease that society should forgive them for. But operating on the premise that transsexuality is a disease, and if transsexuality is caused by hormonal problems in the womb, then perhaps science should invest a great deal of time finding a cure. I'm sure if everyone, and I mean everyone, believed with all their heart and soul that transsexuality was based on prenatal hormone problems, that society would furiously start searching for the cure. To cure this disease, to cure the world of you, to cure the world from you, to make sure people like you never get born. Is this really how the trans community wants to operate, from the premise that you are diseased? You are the symptom of a birth defect, and society would like to cure this disease. It seems to me the focus should be on acceptance. Don't ask society to forgive you for being born botched. Ask society to accept you for being who you are. Let's face it, some people are very masculine and some people are very feminine, and others are anywhere in between. But social norms tell us all masculine thoughts, feelings, and actions belong to the male sex, and all feminine thoughts, feelings, and actions belong to the female sex. So little boys cut away every part of their feelings, thoughts, and actions that are feminine to conform to this cookie-cutter mold of masculinity. Little girls cut away every part of their thoughts, feelings, and actions that are masculine to conform to this cookie-cutter mold of femininity. What we get is a society of masculine men, feminine women, and anything in between is considered botched, immoral, inappropriate, diseased. In that world, what chance does a transgender have? In a world where you are 100% male or 100% female, in looks, thoughts, feelings, and actions, how can you ever pass? What society needs isn't more sympathy for those with the transgender disease, but more tolerance and acceptance of those who don't fit into the cookie-cutter mold. Women need to be allowed to break away from their feminine expectations, and they largely have. And men need to be able to break free of their masculine expectations, and they have a long ways to go. A more gender-neutral and gender-fluid society means men and women can be more free to be themselves, which will equal more diversity of gender expression, and in that environment, trans people are more accepted. I need to point out again, the goal is to encourage tolerance of sexual diversity, which is why I think it is a shame to see elitism in the trans community. I see it becoming more common for a trans person to proclaim that transgender is a very real and scientifically proven medical condition, and those who do not fit this perfect transgender mold are fakers, attention seekers, and mentally ill who need to go get psychiatric help. When you do this, you are coming from a position that you have a very real medical disease with ultra-precise symptoms. You are asking society to give your odd behavior a free pass on the grounds that you were born with this disease. And you are trying to separate yourself from other trans people, asking society to accept you while you go ahead and bully those who don't fit the mold and tell society, sure, you can go bully those freaks. They're not real. That guy that thinks he's trans because he put on makeup one day and feels beautiful and wants to look like a girl all the time? What a mental fuck-up. What a freak. He's not trans. He's just mentally ill. He needs help. But I, on the other hand, am a real transgender. My condition is real and scientific and stuff. Dear trans community, this will backfire on you. Every time you do this shit, oh, he's not a real trans woman, you grant all of society a license to be intolerant and ridicule those who are different, those who don't fit society's cis-heteronormative role. Furthermore, this elitism will also tear the trans community apart. What's the next trans community topic going to be? You're not really trans unless you're gender dysphoric? You're not a real trans woman unless you fuck men only? Because trans women who fuck women are just men in skirts. You're not real trans unless you're on hormone replacement therapy. If you don't want sex reassignment surgery, and you're happy with having a penis, you're not trans, you're fake, a cross-dresser at best. You're not really trans unless you've already gotten your sex reassignment surgery. You're not real trans unless you felt this way before you were in kindergarten. Trans elitism divides people into real trans folk, ergo born with this defect, and fake trans folk, ergo fakers and mentally ill. This trans elitism means you are preaching to the heteronormative world that you should be tolerated for your disease. The trans community should be preaching to the heteronormative world that you are to be tolerated for your differences. So long as you are dividing self-proclaimed transgender people into real and fake, you are not being tolerant of differences. And goddammit people, if you, the trans community, can't be tolerant of people's gender identity and gender expression, what fucking chance does heteronormative society have? You're supposed to be teaching society to be inclusive. You can't do this while being exclusionary. You're supposed to be teaching tolerance. You can't do this while being intolerant.
But now, every day, it seems like there's more and more questionable trans experiences out there. Bizarre. Honestly, I just think it's bullshit, and I never want to hurt or disregard anyone's feelings, but I stand by it. It's bullshit. And you're not transgender because you put on some lipstick and you feel attractive. I'm sorry, but you're not. And you're not transgendered if you happen to fall in love with a straight member of the opposite sex. You're just not. Being transgendered isn't a choice, and I honestly think it's fucked up that there's people out there abusing modern science for the sake of personal gain. Honestly, I think these people need psychological help, not hormones. I don't want to have to feel ashamed of being transgender because of people who are fucked up in the head.
I say take it back to Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. He dreamed that one day the walls of segregation would come down, and black boys and girls would hold hands with white boys and girls, and that people would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's what you need to think about. People should not be judged by their sex, sexuality, sexual identity, race, or nationality, but by the content of their character. It is tolerance for the diversity of our nation. Good and bad must not be judged by skin color or reproductive organs, or which reproductive organs you want to have, or who you choose to share those reproductive organs with. It is the integrity of your moral character as a person that makes you good or bad. And light must be shined onto the ignorant masses. They must be made to realize Dr. King's dream, and judge everybody by the integrity of their character. It doesn't matter if you're pre-op, post-op, dysphoric or not, male to female or female to male, butch or feminine. You are a human being who should be loved or hated based on the integrity of your character. And since I've ranted this long, I might as well add this next statement since I have no idea what other video I'd ever mention it in. Another roadblock to trans acceptance is cisphobia, or downright anger and hatred towards the cis-heteronormative world. If you're not one of these trans people, you at least know many who are. These are people who want to be confrontational and antagonistic towards the cis world, demanding that mainstream society learn all these new pronouns like ze, zer, and der. These ridiculous pronouns are not part of the English language or formal greetings that the mainstream English-speaking world grew up with. Whipping out these silly, pretentious pronouns you expect others to call you by is just obnoxious and makes you look crazy. Society is having a hard enough time calling a non-passing trans person by the opposite sex pronoun. But to dump all these other pronouns on them, that's just too much. Also, taking offense to every little thing at the drop of a hat. The hypersensitivity expressed by the Tumblr trans community makes cis people feel like they have to walk on eggshells when they're around trans people. Thus, they'd rather not be around trans people. Calling cis people privileged is an attack on cis people. It reeks of resentment and entitlement, all the while pointing an accusatory finger at cis people and insulting them. What you are calling cis privilege is more accurately trans disadvantage. Now you may be saying that this is just semantics, and you're essentially right, but this semantic is very important. To point your finger at the sissies and call them privileged makes them feel attacked. How far are you going to get when the first thing you do is put them on the defensive, accusing them of being privileged shitlords? Whip out all these brand new made-up pronouns that you demand to be called by, and remind them that you will be uber offended at the drop of a hat. How can cis society be tolerant of you when you're not going to be tolerant of cis society or even your own trans folk who have to pass some tranny litmus test or be deemed faker who is mentally ill and needs help? They need help, not hormones. And think about it. When you bully other trans people because their motives for being trans or the expression of their transsexuality doesn't pass your litmus test, and you deride them as being mentally ill who need help, you give cis society a license to bully those individuals, because you took away the protected class LGBT umbrella they operated under and divided the trans community. When cis society has a license to call out and bully individuals who don't pass the trans litmus test set up by the elitists, that license to bully, shame, and ridicule is just going to spill over onto the entire community because mainstream society cannot differentiate between fake trans and real trans based on the silly superficial rules which were created out of thin air by self-righteous trans people. So to wrap this up, stop being elitist. You can't convince mainstream cis society to accept you when you can't even accept each other. Stop attacking cis society. How can the sissies accept you when you aren't even trying to accept them? How can they be tolerant of you when you aren't tolerant of them? Stop being the utmost hypersensitive crybabies under the special snowflake umbrella threatening to be offended and triggered by everyone and everything at the drop of a hat. Stop insisting that your transsexuality is the result of a goddamn birth defect and that your medical condition warrants you special exemption from criticism. But instead, tell people to be tolerant of your lack of conformity to heteronormativity. Right now and for the next few years, trans rights is a big hot-button topic. This is your one and only shot to gain mainstream acceptance. Stop showing your ass and put your best foot forward. And to break this all down, society has two kinds of people, completely masculine and completely feminine. It is more beneficial to the trans community for society to stop having a binary expression of gender, and to have a more diverse spectrum of gender expression than it is to ask heteronormative society to give your lack of conformity to the binary a free pass because you were born with a birth defect. This ties into trans elitism because trans elitism is based on the idea that real trans people are the result of a medical birth defect that presents itself in a very specific way, and those whose behavior or motives differ don't fit the birth defect paradigm and are thus fake trannies, mentally ill and need help. Stop pushing the birth defect paradigm and start pushing for a tolerance towards gender differences. I'm not saying you have to accept someone as a transgender when they identify as a female refrigerator. But you shouldn't attempt to narrow transgender down to gender dysphoria either.